Chronicles have been going on for ages. More than 5,000 years ago, the ancient Egyptians told their future descendants about their lives in cuneiform. But the most interesting parts of world history are always wars. We found ourselves on opposite sides of the fence with you before, and now we're going to the battlefield again to see how the legendary T-34 Soviet tank fought. Due to its great driving skills, it's effective in maneuvering, hitting flanks, taking key points, and breaking through to artillery. But you should avoid clusters of enemies because of its small safety margin and thin armor. And the world of tank games helped us take a little trip into the past. It's a classic that stood the test of time, and deep customization of armored vehicles will allow any player to tailor their combat style. And there are so many maps, you'll never get bored. Hey, if you're bored of those war-torn cities and hot deserts, why not give this game a shot? It's totally free and runs great on even weak PCs, thanks to its optimization. Just use the link to register. And guess what? On February 23rd, you can get a whole week of premium tanking with a real tanker, plus 400k credits, to try your hand at the battlefields. Just click the link in the description to get started. Despite the fact that there were dozens of states on the planet in ancient times, ancient Egypt is considered the most important one. It's no surprise given all the wonders of the world and the mighty achievements of the ancient Egyptians, some of which are more than 9k years old. We've just decided to start a new section, and now we'll try to cover the whole history of Egypt in just 10 minutes. The task isn't easy, but we need your help. Tell us in the comments if you'd be interested in this category. You know, I was thinking, maybe we could talk about some of the countries that will be featured in our next video. We're moving away from history books and textbooks, and we're going to break up the history of Egypt into three main parts: ancient, Greco-Roman, and Arabic. We'll focus on the important stuff, like the major events and milestones, instead of getting lost in all the little details. But we'll still include some interesting tidbits and facts, of course. Let's start with a brief introduction and skip ahead a few thousand years. Back then, Africa was a very different place. There were tropical forests where human civilization first began, as we talked about in the video with Pithecanthropus. Later in Africa in general, and in Egypt in particular, the land turned into a savanna. There are few traces of the oldest people who lived there. Scientists suggest that Homo sapiens appeared in these areas because Egypt was an ideal place for them to migrate from East Africa to Asia. About 10,000 years ago, however, they were displaced by the Semitic people, whose origin scientists are still debating. Hard-working people settled in Egypt because of the incredible fertility of the Nile River. In fact, ancient people referred to Egypt as the gift of the Nile. Tens of thousands of years ago, there was a bay of the Mediterranean Sea on what is now modern-day northern Egypt. Later, it became land and a place where the Nile would overflow its banks, causing insane floods that the gods, after all, made the soil so fertile. The water helped them grow that year. When the Nile returned, the ancient Egyptians ran into its valley, sowed it and harvested it, and then ate it, while the scorching sun was burning out the soil, making it unsuitable for agriculture. But that was only until the next flood of the Nile came, after which things repeated themselves. That's why settlements started appearing in the Nile Valley one after another about 6,700 years ago. There were about 40 small states in the valley, and they all faced the same problem: a lack of workers. To continue feeding the Nile, they had to come up with something. So the small states united to build dams, canals, reservoirs, and other agricultural structures. On the one hand, they wanted to keep the overflowing water of the Nile for longer, and on the other hand, they wanted to sow and cultivate more land. In the 4th millennium BC. So the whole thing started with the formation of two giant states, the Upper and Lower Nile. For a while, they were at odds with each other, but in the end, the Upper Nile came out on top. Pharaohs were defeated and their followers gave birth to what we know as the dynastic period of ancient Egypt. That's when the pyramids were built and there were different kingdoms, the early, middle, and other ones. But that's not really important for us right now. We'll leave that for another time. During the dynastic era, Egypt became a real state. The borders moved away from the Nile, although not too much. An army was formed that successfully defended Egypt from nomads like Arabia and Ethiopia. But most importantly, during this time, the pharaohs ruled with great power and prosperity. The Egyptians built some really impressive structures. It's not all about the pyramids, although those were pretty cool during the ancient kingdom, which was like 2700 to 2100 BC. The Egyptians also mastered geometry and created a solar calendar. They even studied the stars. Those scientific victories were awesome, but the construction of those pyramids would have been impossible without their skill in stone processing and agriculture. The canal systems the ancient Egyptians built are still pretty effective, even compared to modern ones. Along the way, they learned how to bake bread and make beer. They also fully mastered writing and even built the Suez Canal to connect the Mediterranean and Red Seas. Unfortunately, things got worse over time. Climate change and greedy officials led to civil wars for a couple of centuries, which brought Egypt back to its old ways for a while. The Middle Kingdom didn't fare much better. The borders were around 2100 to 1750 BC. Internal turmoil continued, but Egypt did manage to achieve something. The folks there mastered bronze products, started opening schools, and introduced the use of papyrus. They also mastered creating pharaoh statues. The 12th dynasty revived the dry Dawa Lake, turning it into an artificial reservoir for Amenemhat III's water through a complex network of canals, locks, and dams. This gave Egypt what it needed for thousands of years, an artificial lake that not only stored the water from the Nile floods but also raised the level of the river itself, thanks to an amazing engineering feat. Just think about it, 4,000 years ago. The Egyptians calmly opened the tap and irrigated the fields. The lake had enough water for like 100 days or so. Immediately, the pharaoh built himself a pyramid and a labyrinth, which the ancient Greeks called the wonders of the world. But unfortunately, the period ended when almost the whole Nile Delta was taken over by Asian nomads. A couple of hundred years later, a new kingdom started from around 1500 BC to 1000 BC. Our Egypt rose from the ashes during that time. The territory reached its height. The people learned how to dig wells and use chariots. The Egyptians gave light to the Persians, and everyone around it was during that era when famous Ramses II and Nefertiti lived. Temples were built, writing improved, great attention paid to child education. However, the temple building killed the state of the priests of Amon. Egypt was plunged into chaos for 400 years and the pharaohs kept changing like gloves. Sometimes, the rules were 5 pieces and the church was almost killing the state. Then, Persians joined in and Egypt was conquered by the Greeks with the help of their hired army. The pharaoh managed to shake things up a bit, but in 525 BC Egypt became a full-fledged colony. From that point on, ancient Egypt was never independent again. But then, in 332 BC, Alexander the Great recaptured Egypt and made it part of his empire. The wonders of the world started to be built, like the lighthouse and the library of Alexandria. Alexandria became one of the major players in the international arena and Egypt again became a major supplier of bread. So, the capital of science back then was basically the planet. But then they started speaking and writing in Greek, and traditional writing was kind of dying out. The last of it was during the Ptolemaic dynasty, which you know is when Cleopatra was around. She eventually married Julius Caesar and in the 30s BC, she made Egypt part of the Roman Empire, which lasted until 42 AD, or 600 years. During that time, Egypt was just a supplier and not really known for anything special. The Alexandrian library was slowly looted and then destroyed by the Arabs in 640 AD, who took over from the Romans. They brought Islam to Egypt, and it assimilated the country faster than the Greeks. At the same time, they were working on the Suez Canal, and for a couple of hundred years after that, the whole country was kind of in decline. So, Egypt started to use Arabic and became totally Arabic, like a spoiler. And it's still like that today. In 870, they broke away from the Arab Caliphate, and for like 700 years, they were kinda independent on paper, but not really. The most famous person was Saladin, who fought the Crusaders and made the country bigger. But aside from that, not much happened. Scientists say that the people of that time didn't use the land well, and the country wasn't overpopulated or underpopulated. There was one exception though, Ahmed ibn Tuluan. Under his rule, Egyptians learned how to make textiles and became richer. Then in 972, they started the oldest university in the world, and then in 1517, they became part of the Ottoman Empire, which was like a colony. It was kind of like Rome. Only now, the country has fed the Turks and fulfilled all their demands. Of the interesting things worth mentioning, there's Napoleon's not-so-successful campaign in Egypt before the Suez Canal was built, connecting the Mediterranean and Red Seas. The pharaohs dreamt of such a canal, but in the end, in 1869, the French and British completed it and later totally took away all profits from the Egyptians. Spoiler alert, after numerous uprisings, Egypt took ownership of the canal for themselves and now, the income from the canal ranks second in the country, right after tourism. At the same time, Egypt fell under the British Empire, having actually lost its independence. The world ruler of Egypt tried to side with Germany but was instantly crushed, and the country became a colony of Britain. Egyptians fought so hard for their freedom that after a few decades, in 1936, the British gave them full independence. But even though Egypt continued to fight in the Second World War, there was a group that wanted to support Germany. They managed to keep Egypt neutral on paper, but in reality, they were still helping the British. The country declared war only in 1945, but the British used Egypt as a base for their troops and airplanes. This led to the 1952 revolution and the poverty, corruption, and tiredness that came with it. Egypt finally became a modern country with a president who has his own independent policy, especially with the Suez Canal, which was nationalized. So the war between Egypt and Britain, France, and Israel started in 1952. It's not hard to imagine that the people there didn't have a chance, but help came out of nowhere. On one hand, the US put pressure on its allies, not wanting them to fight without its permission. On the other hand, the USSR saw Egypt as a great ally. Khrushchev even threatened England and France with nuclear strikes on their capitals, under pressure from the two superpowers and the UN. The war stopped, but relations cooled and Egypt still holds grudges against its enemies. That's for political analysts, though. We've done our part. We hope you liked our retelling of Egyptian history. If you did, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments about similar topics. Until next time, friends.